fun because there's something you're trying to accomplish. And then the terrain makes it so it's not just basic and boring or whatever. And terrain is super duper easy. You just need like flagging tape or cones or some combination thereof. And you can kind of like make combinations of terrain. So like I know that there was one game we did where, okay, these sections are water where you can go heel to toe through it to get through. And then another section is just a lava pit. Sorry, if you step in that, you're dead. Have fun. Good luck. Don't get shoved into it. So like that adds flavor and variety. And I mean, you can even do that with capture the flag, right? Like it's a very basic objective. Most people know how to play it, but instead of just like, oh, it's capture the flag again. Yay. Okay, now it's capture the flag, but with lava. And so you can get like more sneaky stuff going around and things like that too. Something to consider as well is like when you set up the field, try not to have it so there's just like, doesn't just become a single line, right? So if anybody here was at Taldegor's Endrain, we did at the end a bridge ring the bell. You might have noticed there were 2 bridges. Now that's because when you have one bridge, inevitably it ends up with pole arms at the front just fighting each other and everybody else is kind of standing around not having a whole lot to do. When you put in a second bridge, then there's a whole nother avenue that people can go on. There's more opportunities to fight and it kind of spreads people out. It's not all bottlenecked into just a couple people fighting. And so that can be helpful as well, just providing areas where people can fight. When you're setting up your field, you also don't really want your respawns to be close to your objective. I think most of the times, like for said ring the bell, you would have the bells at either end kind of centered on your field, and then your respawns would be diagonal from each other but farther away. I probably would help if I had a picture, but I don't. I can work on maybe getting you a picture while talking on other things. But yeah, that's just something to consider too, because you don't want your respawn to be right by your objective, because then both A, a team is getting spawn camped, and B, a team is also getting like the objective just has people on it constantly and they can't really do anything about it. Oh. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen that I'm sharing. If not, my apologies. But basically what I was saying is you could have like your bell here, your other bell here, and then you'd have a respawn here, and then you'd have a respawn here. So that way the people actually have to like go to the objective and they're not just like right on top of it when they spawn in. And that way they don't have to like run really far either, but that's just something to consider when you're setting up a field as well.
For those listening to the audio content, the respawn is about 20 feet to the left or right of the objective at any given time.
Yeah. And that's something else to consider too when you're setting things up, is like a lot of times you don't always have the space for it, but if you're going to have opposing objectives, you kind of want to think about where's your 50 feet, where's your 20 feet, stuff like that. Like for example, with the double bridges, I didn't really want people to cast from bridge to bridge because I think that gets really messy. Because then it's like, well, I said this to you, and it's like, okay, well, I was looking at the 10 people in front of me, like I have no idea what you said, and I'm very sorry about it. So like that's something else to consider, is like what are areas where people could get salty in the game, and how do you eliminate it so that it's less likely that people don't have a good time. So if you're able to see the visual, there's a little red box around the area between the 2 bridges. So between that, there was just nothing could go through. Infinitely high walls in every direction up, whatever. You could not cast across bridges. But like assassins and wizards, they have fun spells that let them mess with that kind of stuff, and you don't want to kill their fun either. So that's why I kind of gave a little space on either side of the bridges where you could then you could cast or shoot or whatever across. Ooh, hello. Well, if I could find my mouse, there we go. So this was combat lanes, and you could shoot from over here and hit somebody over here. Like, that was perfectly valid. It was just this main area because you kind of just want to make it easier for people to play the game and not be worried about a bunch of stuff. There's a picture of the very confusing drawing now in the chat, so yeah, good luck with that. Making sense of it. But yeah, like, that's something to consider too. And then, yeah, so just like making sure that wherever your terrain is, it makes sense for the game that you're doing. Like for this, okay, it's a bridge battle, so we set these were actually in reality much farther back. But just like, again, having that middle section not be something that people can fight through, just to make it easier for everybody to have good honor, not get confused, not misunderstand what's going on, things like that. Yeah, and then also kind of something to think of too when you're coming up with an idea for a game is I don't necessarily think that games that feed into other games are great, because if you have like more of an advantage for one team in the first game, then they either keep it in the second one or you mix up teams. I don't know, Kylus, how much you're going to go into balancing, but I definitely prefer when I'm splitting teams for any kind of game to have it be something where I can very easily rebalance, because I am very human and I very much do not always get the balances right on the first go rounds. So that's something to think of too, like with your games is, okay, is this something that's easy for me to swap up teams on if things are a little wonky to begin with? I personally abhor Amp Standard Time. It upsets me. It makes me angry. I was a band nerd whose band director's motto was, if you're 15 minutes late, if you're 15 minutes early, you're on time, or early is on time is late. And so when we're starting not even on time, I don't like it. So basically, what helps with making sure things are on time is having stuff set up nice and early. Start your weapons check like half an hour before you want your game to start. Make sure you make plenty of announcements letting people know when things are going to happen. Like 10 minutes before, hey, we're going to be going over the rules in 5 minutes. Have your stuff ready to go. 5 minutes to start time. Hey, we're going to start going over the rules. Make sure you're ready to go. And then at the start time, start. It does not matter how many people are there. It does not matter if half of the people are still armoring up. If you're at an event and they know that, oh, shoot, we're running on time, not Amp Standard Time, they will make themselves ready. I learned this from Manama in Rising Winds, because the first time I went to Bridge Wars, I was like, oh, the next battle game starts at like 3. I've got time to like get stuff together. It's Amp Standard Time. It's 3 o'clock. He's going over the rules and I still don't have my armor on. And so I learned very quickly that if Manama's running a game, you put yourself there on time. So really, the other thing too with that is just, you kind of have to have an idea of how long your games will take, but also be a little bit flexible with them. So like, for example, if you know that you want to run X amount of 10-minute rounds, so say you want to run like 10 or 3 10-minute rounds, okay, that's 30 minutes a round. And then you're probably going to have about 10 minutes of downtime in between each round. So then that's another 30 minutes. So that's an hour. So you're going to give yourself an hour for that. You want to make sure to give yourself like an hour, a half an hour or so afterwards for people to like get water, get snacks, that kind of stuff, and then go. Also be very willing to just like slaw off a round or something like that. But yeah, and like the thing with time-based games too is it's nice when you can score throughout games. I know that's not, or throughout like the rounds. I know that's not always a possibility because Reeves and things like that are limited. But then it's kind of fun because it's not like you're saving everything up for one big push at the end. You're not like trying to stall or this or that. It's like, oh shoot, no, we got to be pushing, going the whole time. And so that can also be really, it can add more energy to games when people are like, oh shoot, we have to be scoring consistently. Interesting. And if you are going to have a game where it's like different objectives for different sides or different rules for different sides, try really, really hard to make sure you're going to have enough time to run it with both people getting to be on both sides. Because it really sucks when it's like, oh, attacking sounds like a ton of fun. I can't wait to do that. And then you just don't get to attack. But yeah, so if you are going to do a game where like the rules are different for each side, try to run it twice so that everybody gets to be on both sides. Because otherwise you kind of, again, get some of that like frustration and salt, and it can just lead to people not having as good of a time. Kind of all I've got, but yeah, the main things are just simpler is better. Make sure people are playing the games as much as possible. And that can be accomplished maybe through like 3-man spawns or shorter respawns, but if you want to give your healer some love, of course, you can do slightly longer spawns too. And yeah, amp guarders are dumb, but I say that with affection because I am an amp guarder and I'm very dumb. And I love playing objectives too, but there's also been times when the objective is explained and I've heard it 3 times and I still don't really know what I'm supposed to do. So sometimes simpler is better. Yeah. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I know that was very rambly and did not have a lot of direction, but that's kind of how my brain works when I'm putting together games and stuff. So I'll look into the process.
Thank you for sharing, Sypha. There was some really, really good insight in there. There's actually a few subjects that you hit that I'm going to be diving into a little bit more in the rest of this class. So it was really convenient that you brought them up already, so we already have a baseline nailed down. But before we move on, does anyone have any questions for Sypha? All right. Well, again, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to share with us, and it was really good insight. So for those of you that are new to this, or even people that have a little bit of experience, like take these words to heart. There's some really, really solid advice in what she had to say. So.
Thank you, Becky.
You're welcome. I had to find the unmute button. You'd think I'd know where it is with how much I use Discord.
Not a problem.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, I have 7 pages of notes for this module, and I'm going to do my best to shoot through them as fast as possible so I don't keep you guys super long. But I have titled this module A Deep Dive into Balance, and I have 3 main points that I want to hit on. And conveniently, the first point that I want to hit on is balancing player expectations and enjoyment, which is something that Sypha touched on earlier, specifically with the attacker-defender style games, games where the 2 teams are competing for separate objectives. It's going to really tie into this whole player balance and enjoyment topic. So just as a real quick overview, the 3 points that I will be focusing on today are, as I said, balancing player expectations and enjoyment. Point number 2 is going to be avoiding win-more scenarios, which we'll get more into that here in a little bit. And then point number 3 is what I call the illusion of balance. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. In our first class, we looked at the basics of battle game construction and how to keep games fresh and appealing without overcomplicating the process. So in this segment, I want to really break down the objectives that we discussed and outline a thought process on maintaining balance as far as the actual objectives that we score. To clarify, this is a different part of the process than balancing teams. As Saifa mentioned earlier, balancing teams can be a very difficult thing to do depending on the scenario that you're in. So one of the most important processes that we do from a design perspective is making sure that the games are balanced, even if the teams might be a little bit skewed. So team balance can be adjusted on the fly, but it is much more difficult to adjust objective balance without confusing your players and causing more potential problems on the field. This isn't to say that it is not occasionally necessary, but a little bit of thought beforehand can go a long way in preventing these types of situations. So one of our first steps is to examine our objectives and our field setups for any glaring imbalances. So just to start off with a couple of really simple examples of what the point I'm trying to make. Let's look at a game. We'll say we're playing a militia rules kill the captain game. So one team selects the player with the most armor. They have 7 points on their torso. They have 6 points on everything else. Militia, allowing that extra point of armor on their chest if they're wearing a heavy helm. So one team selects that player as their captain. The other team is going to select their best fighter, who is coincidentally not wearing any armor. So in this scenario, we have an imbalance between the captains. So it's a militia game, so there's no class rules, there's no magic or anything. So armor is the biggest swing factor in militia besides actual player skill. And with one team having a captain that has armor and the other team having a captain that does not have armor, it's not really going to be an equal fair game for both sides. So looking at this, how do we address that imbalance? Do we give the unarmored captain an equal amount of magical or natural armor for the game? Well, that's not really fair either, because that creates an additional imbalance, because now the player that is benefiting from armor without actually having to put the armor on is at a higher advantage versus the armored player that is going to be... Do what? Okay, anyway, the player that is not wearing armor, that is getting the benefit of armor, is going to be at a higher advantage versus the player that actually has to wear the armor and take the physical penalty. So the best way to address this imbalance is just to create a standard rule set for anyone who chooses or gets elected as a captain. An example in this specific scenario would be all captains have X points of armor. So whether you're wearing armor or not, you get a set standard amount of armor. If this information is known before teams choose their captains, it will influence their decision, and then the results of the game are going to be based off of that decision rather than the imbalance of, we're just going to pick the guy with the most armor, versus the team that has less armor. So that's an example of how to fix an imbalance in a very simple imbalance that's mostly common sense. Another really simple one that I want to touch on. Let's say we're playing a class version of a Ring the Bell game, and you realize after the field is set up that the bell is 10 feet closer to one team's spawn point than the other. Obviously there's a simple fix. You just adjust the bell to be equal distance from both team spawns. So, both of these actions, while really simple, mostly common sense, it's pretty easy to look at these scenarios and think, that needs fixed. But laying them out like this is going to help us establish our base process, and that will help us moving forward when addressing different imbalances that are much easier to spot or harder to determine what the actual fix is. So now let's move into some more advanced issues. And I'm going to be breaking these down from a player perspective before moving into the solution for our process, so we can better understand the minutia and how the decisions that we make during the design process genuinely affect our players in ways that a lot of people don't often think about. So, truly balanced games that are the most fun for everyone often require changing our perspective and looking at it from the perspective of the player rather than from the designer. So going back to our Kill the Captain game that we talked about earlier, the Militia Kill the Captain game, let's look at this from the captain's perspective, specifically the captain of the team. So from personal experience in running these types of games, the traditional method of scoring this game is really simple. Win condition games end when the captain dies, while progressive scoring games will tally each time a captain dies and award the victory to the team with the fewest captain deaths or the most captain kills, depending on how the Reeves have decided to score that specific game. Again, the win condition versus progressive scoring we talked about in our class last month. And just to reiterate, win conditions are do this, game's over, you win, versus progressive scoring, which Sypha talked about earlier. You are keeping a tally throughout the entire game, so it's less of a one big push style game and more of a constant player engagement style deal. Anyway, so both of these methods are functional and they're easy enough to run, but are they truly balanced? So for most players, sure, the objective is simple, it's easy to focus on, and it allows them to approach the objective pretty much however they like. But for the captain specifically, it's a different story. So when a player gets chosen or voted into this position for this style of game, they now have a layer of responsibility that the other players won't even consider or think about because they're not in that position. So for these players that are thrust into these captain roles, every time they die, it penalizes their team, ultimately being the sole reason that they win or lose. So that kind of pressure causes people to play differently, and for many means that they do their best to avoid combat altogether. I mean, obviously, why would you risk fighting when your death specifically means your team will lose? But if you're avoiding combat, then you're kind of missing out on the whole reason that we do battle games in the first place. So here we have an imbalance that is not necessarily in the actual rules of the game, but it is an imbalance as far as player enjoyment is concerned. So how do we address this one? Well, with this perspective in mind, let's go back to the rules for the game. We have created a scenario where the captain, oftentimes the strongest player on their team, feels like getting into the thick of it and being involved in the bulk of the fighting is purely detrimental to their team. We can try and put a band-aid over the problem by increasing the power level of the captain, giving them more armor, giving them enchantments, etc., but none of these address the root problem. So the root problem being the captain doesn't have a reason to fight other than pure survival. So in a combat scenario, the best solution for their team is to not fight at all and to run away and let their team do everything they can. And just to reiterate, that can be really frustrating for people because just as an example, at Curse in October of last year, we ran a Kill the Captain style game, and I happened to be reaving on one side of the field, and a player who had been chosen for the captain role was getting they weren't having a super good time. They were sitting at the back of their force, not engaging in combat, and they were just watching everybody else fight. And I approached them and was like, "Hey, what's the deal? Why aren't you getting into combat?" And the player said to me, well, if I die, my team loses, so what's the point? So, this whole objective scenario for these players specifically, for the players that are thrust into this captain role, can be really lackluster. It's fun for everybody else, but for these specific players, it's either at best a neutral time, or in worst case scenarios, they actively dislike what is going on. So, to fix this, to address the root cause of this problem, we as the game designer need to give our captains a reason to fight, a reason to get involved and be in the forefront of what's going on. So to do this, taking a look at our design perspective, this is a kill style game, as we laid out in the first class we had last month. So what if we combined this kill objective with an element from a control type objective? So if you add a decent size control point in the center of the battlefield that is equal distances from both teams' spawn points and both their captains, and you modify the scoring to be, instead of kill the captain, get a point, the scoring now becomes, as long as your captain remains alive inside of this point in the middle of the battlefield, you are getting points. So this is a little bit harder on Reeves, just because you're going to now need a Reeve to follow each captain around with the stopwatch. But doing this, we've now given the captain a reason to be not just involved, but quite literally be in the middle of the action. So the overall feel of the game is the same. You're still competing to kill the enemy captain while keeping your own alive. But now that we've addressed the imbalance from the captain's perspective and made the whole game more enjoyable for everyone, our captains now have a reason to get involved. They have a reason to get in the thick of it. And the overall game hasn't changed. But we have fixed the imbalance from the captain's perspective. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is one of those things, and I'm going off my notes and ad-libbing here. But this is one of those things, like, as a game designer, it's really easy to overlook situations like this. Example at Curse, like, big kingdom level event for Rivermore. For those of you that attended, like, it was really, really good event. But this one game specifically, the war team did not address this concern, and it led to me having an interaction with the captain of a specific team and realizing that we had made a mistake in the design process. So I actually tried out this workaround that I just talked about with the node in the middle that the captains have to be alive to be scoring, and it worked really well. The captains got involved, they had fun, and the overall game wasn't any different. Like I said earlier, everyone was still just competing to kill the enemy captain, but the captains also got to have fun and be in the middle of it and take advantage of the fact that they had really strong rules. And it just overall, like, working this into a game state where everybody was able to have fun in the way that they wanted to have fun was a really beneficial change overall. So it's stuff like this, and this is why I say this is a deep dive into balance, because sometimes your rules can be fair on the surface, but when they affect specific players more than they do other people, you really have to fine-tune them so they're not being disadvantageous to specific people.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
So from what you're saying, we can mechanically balance things like that. but that involves more reeves. What would you do in a situation when you have little to no reeves available for like a small park day?
So in a situation like that, I would just avoid objective types that are going to disproportionately affect individual players. So this kill the captain style game, I mean, technically on a small park level, you could do it with one reeve if you had two stopwatches. That would be relatively difficult from a reeve standpoint, trying to track which captain's alive, which captain's dead, whether they're insubstantial or frozen or whatever, if that affects your game at all. It would be a lot harder for one reeve to do it, but it wouldn't be impossible. You would just have to really keep up on what you're doing and make sure that you have a stopwatch for each team. But as a general rule, I would avoid trying to run games like this at a small park level that you don't have the reeve staff to truly do it justice. So you can I mean, and this is one of those things like that. This specific imbalance is not going to come up super often. It's just one that I wanted to point out specifically and be like, any game where you design something that will disproportionately affect individual players on your field, you just have to really take into consideration whether or not those specific rules are hampering their ability to enjoy the game.
Roger, thank you.
So to finish up this point, just always be mindful of how your games will impact your players, especially in unusual ways, and you will be well on your way to creating games that will be fondly remembered for years to come. In summation, just to reiterate this point, make sure that any rule that you design that impacts a certain player or players more so than others has checks and balances designed to keep everybody involved in having fun. Does anybody have any questions regarding that point? All right, moving right along. So point number 2 is going to be avoiding win more scenarios. And again, Sypha actually touched on this a little bit. She didn't call them win more scenarios, but she touched on some examples of win more scenarios in her speech. So an important part of any learning process is defining terms in ways that are easy to understand. So what do I mean when I say a win more scenario, and why are they important? So my definition is this: any scenario or rule set in which completing or scoring a game objective creates an advantage for completing or scoring that objective again. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and that's a lot of information to remember and process. But hopefully, as we dive into this and explain it, it'll become a little bit easier to understand. So, some examples of win more scenarios that I have written down. Let's say we have a very heavy object in the middle of the field, and the goal is to get the very heavy object as close to your team's base or your spawn point as possible throughout the course of the game. So, commonly referred to as pull the cart. So, let's say a team makes a really big push in the first 30 seconds. They have a couple of people that are just a little bit faster than players on the other team. Oh, excuse me. And they get to the cart first. They begin moving the cart toward their spawn point. So now the cart has moved from an equal distance between the two teams and is getting closer and closer to the winning team's spawn point. So as that cart gets closer to the spawn point, it becomes much more difficult for the team that is losing to get access to the cart because they are now running a farther distance away, and the winning team has a much shorter distance to travel and can play very, very defensively from an advantageous position. So this is an example of a win more scenario. The closer you get your objective to your base, the easier it is to keep your objective close to your base. And this is a really imbalanced scenario. And Gall, you and I had this conversation I think a week ago, where you had a similar situation like this come up, and you realized that it was a problem. You addressed it and you fixed it. But this is just one example of what constitutes a win more scenario. Another situation that would constitute a win more scenario, let's say we're playing a capture game and you have 50 objects scattered around the battlefield, and the goal is to bring them back to your base. It's a really similar concept. Like, the team that gets more in the first 30 seconds of the game can pretty much just take up defensive posturing, and then since they're respawning really close to their nest, if you will, their capture point, then the enemy team has to work so much harder to get access to the objectives to even out the game. One flag capture the flag is a really good example of this. If the flag is in the center of the battlefield, just like with our pull the cart example, one team gets the flag, starts running it back to their base, and now the enemy team has to not only fight through the rest of the enemy team that's not carrying the flag, but they have to travel farther from their spawn point to get to it. So all of these, this is definitely not an exhaustive list by far. These are just some examples to get our brains turning and try to really nail down what a win more scenario is. So I do want to note that game rules that are inherently designed to give an advantage upon completion rather than victory points are an exception to this. An example of that would be the siege, or the Grove Siege game that I wrote for the Kingdom Raid on Gaia's Grove about a month ago. I had a built-in rule where the defending team could do a specific thing in game, and they could push the attacking team's spawn point farther and farther away. That did not have any effect on the actual victory conditions of the game. It was just you can focus on winning the game, or you can focus on making it harder for them to win the game, but you can't do both. This is not an example of a win more situation, and would be an exception to this rule. So regarding this scenario, objectives that are purely neutral or even give the opposing team an advantage when you score them will lead to much more dynamic games that typically won't snowball into a completely one-sided match that leaves players feeling salty. This is something that does happen in these win more scenarios, and I've played a lot of games in the eight and a half years that I've been playing Amtgard, and almost every single time there is I have come across a win more style objective, it has led to the losing team feeling pretty salty, because like I said, it just becomes harder and harder, and it feels like an uphill battle that they're fighting, and they feel like they never got a fair chance. So the game getting harder for a team that's already losing can be really demoralizing, with the likely destination of well, why should I even bother at this point attitude, which also leads to feelings of a hollow victory for the winning team. Because even if you're on the winning team, if let's say in our pull the cart example, you were one of the players that got to the cart first. You started pulling the cart towards your spawn point, and the enemy team was like, oh, well, they won, and they just give up. And then you have 10 minutes of like, oh, aren't you guys going to come after the cart? And they're like, no, why would we? You guys are spawning right next to it. So like, even as the winning team, this can feel really hollow and lead to a not enjoyable game. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, objectives that become easier for the losing team to score can offer really effective comeback scenarios and rally points that create dynamic flow of push and pull, making every game feel like a nail biter and giving players that sense of urgency and engagement that everything that they do matters throughout the entire duration of the game. So when you know what to look for, it's pretty easy to determine what constitutes a win more scenario, but oftentimes they're overlooked in the design process, and paying attention to these details will serve you well as you continue down the path of battle game design. So in summation, win more is bad. Win more does not lead to fun games. It's bad for the losing players because they get demoralized. It's bad for the winning players because it feels like a hollow victory. And just every time you look, every time you get a completed game write-up, just make sure you double check that there is no scenario that is going to lead to one of these situations. Does anybody have any questions regarding win more scenarios? All right, moving on. Point number 3, and this is the one that I have by far the most notes on. That is what I like to call the illusion of balance. So this is actually going to tie directly into a question that I believe Red and Bear asked in our first class regarding battle game basics. And to reiterate the question, it was about combining objective types. We went over the kill, capture, control objective types, and I was asked if combining those was a good idea. And the short answer was yes, but we're going to do a deeper dive into it now. So when it comes to design, the number of players has a huge impact on what is feasible and what isn't. The fewer players on the field, the harder it is to effectively implement multiple objective types. So typically, I kind of have a rule of thumb that I follow, and like I said in the first class, like, there are exceptions to every rule, so don't feel like this is the only thing that you can base this off of. But just as a general rule, if I have 2 to 7 players, I use one objective type. If I have 8 to 20 players, I typically incorporate 2 objective types. That size of field is big enough that if you have 20 players fighting over a single control objective, it can kind of get really grindy, and introducing a secondary type objective to kind of spread out the players and give them a little bit more to focus on adds a layer of strategy and tactical know-how to the game. But if you have less than 8, it is very difficult, and if you spread your players out too much, you just don't have enough players to focus on anything. So 2 to 7 players, 1 objective type. 8 to 20 players, 2 objective types. And then if you have more than 20 players, I usually incorporate 3 objective types. So that's typically kill, capture, control. I try to use one of each objective type when I am using, or when I'm designing games for more than 20 players. Now, typically, when you're incorporating multiple objectives, the best practice will be to utilize different objective types for each one. And the example I used was use 1 kill, 1 capture, 1 control. But as long as they are distinct from each other, you can utilize the same typing of objectives. So a good example of this would be a push the cart style game with a node control style objective added in. Because while they both technically fall under our control objective type, they are distinct enough from each other that you're not going to cause confusion on the field, and they're not going to feel stagnant. Like it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm just doing the same thing in a different spot. So, you know, in situations like that, you know, just make sure that all of your different objectives are unique and don't feel like just more of the same. I strongly caution against trying to incorporate more than 3 objectives into any game, as it adds a risk of confusion, slows down game explanations, and it increases your Reeve workload exponentially. and Sypha touched on this as well, with the whole simplification is good. Most of my game explanations, I do try to keep under 2 minutes, because the whole 30-second window that you have to explain a game till Amp-Guarders lose focus is 100% accurate. Like Sypha stated earlier, the longer that you drone on about how your game works, the more likely everyone is to lose focus, which is going to lead to confusion. So when you are combining multiple objectives, 3 is my absolute limit. So to clarify, 3 is regarding objective typings, not necessarily the objectives themselves. So an example of this would be a game where you have 50 of the eggs that I talked about in the last class, my little duct tape eggs. Let's say you have 50 of those scattered across the battlefield. You have 3 different control points, and you have a kill point objective. That game is going to run perfectly fine, and it would be really easy to explain. It'd be like, hey, there's 50 objectives. Team A takes them here. Team B takes them here. There's 3 control points. Make sure your color is on the control point. And don't die. That's really simple game explanation, and realistically, no one should get confused by it. But if you take that same style and you say, oh, hey, this is a game that we have 25 eggs scattered around that need to go. Team A needs to take them here, and Team B needs to take them here. And then we have 25 eggs that Team A needs to take here, and Team B needs to take over here. And then we have 3 capture points, and then we have a kill point objective. It's the same amount of eggs on the field, but because it became a 4th objective type, now players are going to get confused because they're going to be like, oh, well, which egg goes where? I have 2 different points, and there's all these different eggs, and it's going to lead to confusion and just increase the workload with very limited payoff. Like it's not going to add any more dynamicism to the game. Is that a word? If it's not a word, I'm saying it's a word now. Dynamicism. But so same amount of objectives, but increasing from 4 objective types from 3 is just confusing. So I would not add more than 3 objective types to any game, regardless of how many players. Like, it doesn't matter if you have 30 players or 300 players. More than 3 objectives is just going to get overwhelming and not going to be a good deal. So, ideally, game explanations will take 2 minutes or less, as I stated earlier. And the bulk of players will stop listening after 30 seconds. So quick, concise explanations are critical, and that only gets harder as more objectives are added. So now that we have established a baseline process for combining objectives, I want to look at how victory points are earned. The best way to distribute victory points is on an objective type basis. That is to say, each objective type is self-contained and has no effect on other objective types' score. For example, let's look at our 3 objective game that we discussed earlier, the 50 eggs, 3 control points, and a kill point. If we throw every score into the same pool, one team could easily take advantage of the rules, and let's say this game is an arbitrary 10 minutes long. We run progressive scoring on the capture points in 1 minute increments, and one team realizes that mathematically you can score a maximum of 30 points by holding all 3 control points for the full duration of the game, while holding all of the capture objectives would be worth 50 points. If we're throwing all of the scores into the same pool, there are 50 capture objectives, with the 3 control objectives being worth 1 point each in 1 minute increments. So, 50 points for holding all the capture versus 30 points for holding all the control for the duration of the game. The capture objective is obviously going to be easier to score more points on, let's say one team realizes that and the other team doesn't. So the team that realizes the mathematical advantage decides to ignore control points altogether, so they easily collect all the capture objects since the other team has divided focus. So at the end of the game, the team that focused on the numerical advantage likely won, assuming relatively equal team balance. The team that divided their focus, that didn't realize the mathematical advantage, may have played better overall, but since victory came from a single victory point pool, the game was, as we in the game design, industry refer to as broken. They broke the game because they realized there was a mathematical advantage on one objective over the others and focused on that to the point that that was the only thing they had to worry about, and they won. In worse scenarios, teams that may have a skill imbalance can take this even further. And if one team dominates all three objective types, you could have a game that comes out with a score of 68-12 or even worse. Like if one team gets all 50 capture objectives and holds 9 of the 10 control points for the entire game and scores more kill points, the point spread at the end of the game could be really disheartening to look at for the losing team. And it can be really demoralizing. And the higher that the overall score can get, the worse that is going to look from the losing side of the equation. So reining in your scoring and making each individual objective type worth ultimately one victory point can go a long way toward preventing that kind of disparity, and it makes each objective genuinely worth focusing on. So in our above example, let's change it so that each objective, rather than all contributing to a single pool, each objective type is worth one victory point. So the same scenario, we've got 50 eggs, 3 control points, and a kill point objective. One team focuses solely on the capture objectives, just like in our first example, and the other team has full control of the control points. So what happens in this scenario? Well, the one team that focused on the capture objectives, they may have all 50 capture objectives, but that only nets them one victory point. The other team, had full control of the control points, and they ended up with one victory point. So the winner of this game is going to boil down to the kill point objective of who killed more enemy players for ultimately a 2-1 final score. This is the what and why I call this the illusion of balance. So the scenario could have played out exactly the same as our early example where we had a 68-12 score, but the number disparity no longer exists because in a 2-1 versus 68-12, the smaller numbers are going to look better to the losing team, and they're not going to be nearly as demoralizing. And the teams are going to feel like it was close regardless of the outcome, because obviously, it's 2-1. All I needed to do was score 1 point and we would have won, right? So a perfect example of this that I actually lived through, this is the first time that I actually tried to put all of these thought processes into practice, because I, as a battle gamer, I have experienced games that have ridiculous point disparities that honestly felt unnecessary. Like I've been a part of teams that were we looked at battle games to try to figure out what the most mathematically advantageous scoring system was. And there's a lot of games that I've played that had multiple objective types that all contributed to the same pool that I looked at and was like, oh, well, why would I bother focusing on that objective that's going to get me 8 points at the end of the game when I could do this much easier objective the whole game and score 50? So I was coming into the game design process with that in mind, with a thought process on how I could alleviate some of the concerns, make the games that I design much harder to break. So this specific example I'm getting ready to dive into was the first attempt at me trying to fix some of these issues that I had seen with game design that I had run into. So back when I was my first term as Kingdom Champion would have been winter 2019 into spring of 2020. Some of you might remember that was the year that we did the Direbrook raid in January, and then soon after that, in February, we had the raid on Seven Rivers Forge, where the Kingdom got together just to put on a couple of big park days for people. So this would have been February of 2020, right before COVID shut us down. The Seven Rivers Forge raid. So the game that I had designed was, as Kingdom Champion, it was my job to make games for the event. And it was my very first attempt at utilizing my current design process. Like all of these things that we've been talking about, everything that we talked about last month with my process on designing battle games, this was my very first attempt to see if any of it even worked. So all of the methods and ideas that I've been going over in this class were completely untested at this point in time. So for time's sake, I'm not going to go into the details of the game itself that I designed, but I will tell you I utilized 3 objective types. I had a kill objective, a capture objective, and a control objective. But they were all self-contained, so each one was only worth 1 victory point. So there were about 50 players, I would say. It's been a long time, so my memory's a little bit hazy on it. But I'd say there was about 50 players that were playing this game, and I divided up the teams in a way that I thought was balanced. I was very new to the whole concept of large-scale team balancing, and so I will very much emphasize I thought that teams were balanced. We will refer to them as Team A and Team B. So after I called Leon, it didn't take more than a couple of minutes to realize that I had not divided the teams nearly as well as I thought I had, and one team was overwhelmingly stronger than the other when it came to actual combat. So I watched this game go on. I think I'm wanting to say it was a 20-minute long game, and for the next 18 minutes or so, I watched in horror as one team just beat the brakes off of the other team. Like it was, from my perspective, like it was an absolute slaughter. So the game ended, and I did my best to hide how utterly discouraged that I was that I had bombed this game so hard. And it was entirely my fault because the teams were so unbalanced, and I'm the one that split the teams. And the thing that was running through my head was, surely the team that lost that game was just having a terrible time, because I spoke a lot in this course about, demoralization of the losing team. And that's what was going through my head. I'm like, there's no way that the losing team enjoyed that game, and that's what's going through my head as I'm getting ready to count up all of the scoring and everything. So I counted up kill points, and sure enough, Team A beat Team B by a substantial margin. I don't remember the exact details, but it was something like triple. Like Team A had triple the score of Team B when it came to kill points. But because of the way that I was scoring the objectives, I thought, okay, Team A won the kill point objective. So I announced Team A wins the kill points. They get 1 point. So now we're at a 1-0 score. So then I counted up capture points. And again, it wasn't even a contest. Team A, if I remember correctly, I had 100 of our little capture objectives, and I think it was 84-16 on the final score for the capture objective. Again, just an absolute shutout on Team A's side versus Team B. And, you know, they obviously got that victory point. So I announced, oh yeah, Team A wins capture points. Scores 2-0. So after that, I moved on to the control objective. And to my surprise, Team A had focused so much on the kill and capture objectives that they'd pretty much forgotten about the control point objective. And Team B had actually won overall on control points. So I'm looking at the score, and I made the final announcement. Team A triumphed over Team B 2-1. So again, I'd like to state I was feeling pretty upset about it because, you know, like I said, I had watched the game, I'd witnessed the game, and it felt like an absolute shutout that the losing team was probably really salty over, and I was kind of kicking myself over it, and you know, still pretty upset with myself for how imbalanced that I had split those teams. And I will never forget this. As I was walking off the field, I experienced one of the most defining moments of my time in Amtgard. And I had two players from Team B, the losing team, that were walking near me, and I happened to catch a part of their conversation as they were walking off the field. And to my great surprise, they were excitedly chattering away about how close the game had been and how they'd lost by only 1 point. And I remember one of them saying, oh, if we had just done a little bit more on, I'm wanting to say it was the capture objective. Like if we had just focused a little bit more on that capture objective, surely we would have won. And, you know, like I'm over here in my head thinking, did you guys see the same game that I saw? Like, you guys just got absolutely crushed. Obviously, I didn't say that because I didn't want to, I didn't want to add any element of demoralization. And they had a really good time. But, like, for me, that was an eye-opening experience that the absolute blowout that I had messed up so badly as far as team balance was concerned was, as far as the team that lost, they didn't see that. All they saw was that 2-1 score, and they thought that if they had just focused a little bit harder, they would have won. And it was kind of a eureka moment, you know, because not only were they not demoralized, they were invigorated and they were ready to play again. And, you know, let's go to round 2 because we're gonna beat you guys in round 2. And I thought, holy cow, this system works. So to this day, that game remains fondly remembered and still gets brought up to me from time to time. So, you know, that's been over 3 years ago at this point. And, like, still to this day, I recognize that I really screwed up team balance. But the game design was balanced to a degree that the losing team never felt like they were completely shut out just because of the way that I did the scoring system. So if I had announced the actual, like if I had thrown all of the scores together into a single pool, that game would have been like 300-20. But because each objective was its own individual, you know, victory point, the 2-1 score led to everybody having a good time, and nobody felt like they had just gotten completely washed out of the game. So to summarize this point, when your games have a system of rules in place to, for lack of a better term, pad the results of the game in an easy to swallow package, it is easier to prevent player burnout and ensure that everyone enjoys themselves. You can make mistakes, and you will make mistakes, but as long as you analyze them and learn from them and push forward, you know, you're gonna be in a pretty good spot. So if you utilize these best practices, your players might not even realize if you have made a team balance mistake. And again, this is why I call it the illusion of balance. So from my perspective as the game designer and the Reeve, the game was very unbalanced. But from the perspective of the players that were actually playing, They had fun, and they only lost by 1 point, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. The players had fun, and nobody got salty after it. So, in summation for this, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the class. But in summation, just make sure that you can appreciate your players' perspectives as far as all of your rules are considered. Avoid using any type of win more scenario, and package your results for your games in the easiest to swallow form, usually by maintaining separate victory points for each objective type. Does anybody have any questions that they would like me to go over, or points that they would like to see a little bit more discussion on?
I found a picture of him with the fucking vehicle, and I screenshotted it, and then he didn't realize that like 2 months later.
So I have a question. Oh,
You first.
you first. No, you spoke first. You go for it.
I do have a question. Do you differentiate between classes when you do balancing? And how do you go about that?
So yes, to a degree. I mean, obviously, like if there's 2 healers, you try to split the healers. If there's armor, you try to split the armor and whatnot. But knowing your local player base and knowing the players that are involved is going to go a lot longer of a way as far as actually balancing teams than just splitting classes. Like for example, on a small level, like if you have, let's say, 8 people, if you have 8 people playing a part game, and you have one person playing a scout, one person or 2 people playing an assassin, like scouts are really good counters to assassins, so you could put both assassins on one team and put the scout on the other team, and that would kind of help balance out the class perspective, as long as you still have even teams on both sides. But I wouldn't necessarily say that as a gospel rule, balance every class 1-to-1. It's more of a local call with people knowing their player skill levels and what have you. Definitely, as far as casters are concerned and armor, try to split those as evenly as possible between the 2 teams, but never ignore player skill when it comes to those things. Like if you have somebody that is far and away the best fighter in your park, you can pair them against someone with armor, and that will usually balance itself out, because the skill level versus the extra hit points essentially can balance. If only one player has armor, put the best fighter on the other side. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
But I walked out of the thing, like out of the office.
All right, and who had the other question?
Oh, that was me. So, my kind of question is, like, I do sometimes run into this kind of situation, like, because my park is kind of a decent sized park, and there is sometimes a very big skill gap. And balancing is kind of like, okay, it's like, put some top players here, top players there, or kind of make sure it's kind of balanced. But I still run into the issue where it could very well go with like where even though like the teams are like, I see that they're balanced and the game seems kind of balanced, but I still run into issues like, wow, like we just got this team just definitely got steamrolled. And I can even try to like, hey, I'm gonna move some players from this team to that team, and it's the same thing happens, and it could be just because of one really skilled player. So I was wondering if you have like kind of any advice on like balancing when there's like a big skill, when there's kind of a big skill gap sometimes.
I have a quick question, like Kylus, you don't mind me jumping in here.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's a skill gap as far as fighting goes, or just like an understanding of classes and Amp-Guard as a whole?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both.
Okay.
But majority of, I would say, probably in skill and fighting, is probably where it mostly is unbalanced sometimes.
Okay, because I guess if you had the opposite problem, if it was like an understanding of amp guard, I know that something we had to do for a while is like we would cap our class games is that everybody's level 2. Doesn't matter what you are in the orc, you're level 2. Just so that newer people could like learn, I guess. And I don't know how many new people you have, but like it helps a little bit to just have fewer abilities for people to have to worry about sometimes, especially if you have a bunch of new people who are still learning their first level abilities. And like we did a month of everybody's level 1. Okay, now here's a month of everybody level 2, etc., etc. I don't really know much about the fighting stuff, but maybe like have a couple days where you do like 10 or 15 minutes of just like fighter practice drill things. Anyways, Kylus, back to you.
Yeah, that's. I mean, she hit the nail on the head. Like sometimes, limiting class abilities, limiting levels and whatnot can go a really long way towards feeling like that disparity isn't quite as long or quite as far. Another thing, you're from Night's Rest, correct?
Correct.
So another thing, you guys have enough of a average like attendance on Park Day that maybe having equal amounts of players on each team is not always going to be the answer. And ideally that's going to be the way it is. Like you're going to have equal amounts of players on each team, but sometimes throwing a extra 2 people onto one side versus the other can go a really long way in evening out some of those skill level imbalances. Because like let's take Big Head. Like Big Head is obviously terrifying on the field, but if you get 3 people fighting him at the same time, 3 people are usually going to put up a pretty good fight, even if they are playing at a lower skill level. So, like, if you divide the teams up, let's say 8-6, and you have, the best player on the team of 6, maybe that's something that you can look at as well. I did go over this a little bit last month as far as equal amounts of players doesn't always mean balanced teams. So,
Ditch lines.
yeah, that ditch line is actually a perfect example of it. So maybe experiment around and just try to see what you can figure out as far as how many players does it take to equal your top players on the field, and then go from there.
Gotcha.
If you have 3 people against Big Head, at least one of them is going to take a limb or get that butt gap in his armor. One of the 2.
Always aim for the butt gap.
Oh yeah, always go for the butt gap.
Like just listen. He literally incriminated himself right there. Sorry for how.
All right. Does anybody have anything else that they would like to see addressed?
So hard to believe such an evil monster who beat you and did everything
You guys
possible.
kind of killed my joke. My joke was Big Head plus armor equals 3.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
He literally admitted shit that he did.
All right. Well, I need to start getting ready for work, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the class. I appreciate you all for coming. Sypha, I really appreciate you speaking. You had some really good insight. And yeah, appreciate you all, and have a good night.